Hi everyone. We have two short poems to discuss today. Mary Oliver's Farm Country and Langston Hughes' Harlem. You may have come across the Langston Hughes poem at some point in high school or other writing courses, but maybe it's new to you. But we're gonna dig through both of them to talk about metaphor and how to use metaphor effectively to create specific effects on your reader, but also to use those effects to deliver your message or your idea or your purpose more effectively. So, we're first going to talk about metaphor today and get an understanding of what we want to try to accomplish when we write in metaphor. And then we'll move to the poems and see how they deliver their meaning or create some of their message through metaphor. So I'm first going to go to a page that just explains metaphor a little bit. Now you've learned metaphor before, you've learned simile, um, and this is going to be a refresher to remind you of how it operates, but then also some of the best ways to use metaphor. So basically, metaphor follows an equation that says A is B. This thing is that thing. It's a comparison between these two things, A and B, to help the reader understand something or picture something or imagine something on a deeper level than your just explanation of one thing or description of one thing could do. So in this equation, A is B. A is the thing that is abstract. It's the thing that you're trying to make sense of or explain on a deeper level. So it's abstract, it is unfamiliar to the audience, it is potentially vague, meaning it's not specific or it's not clear. It might be completely unknown, this thing that you're trying to explain or describe, or it might be difficult to know. And it's either an idea or an emotion or a thing. So that's a very broad category. You use metaphor all the time. You use it in discussion with your friends. When you're having trouble explaining something or describing something, you go to metaphor. It was like this. It is this. Usually we use simile in conversation like that, but it works the same way. A is like B instead of A is B. So you've done this before. You have an unfamiliar concept that you want your listener or your reader to understand on a deeper level. So the best thing to say is that it's unknown or unfamiliar. Now, B, on the other hand, in this equation is concrete, which means it's physical, it's familiar to the audience, it's specific, they know it, or if they don't know it exactly, it's easy to know, either object or action. So the best way to make sense of this is to look at our first metaphor from Mary Oliver's Farm Country. She says, life is chicken soup served in blue willow patterned bowls. Now, life, in this case, is the A. It's abstract. Not necessarily because it's unfamiliar. We are all familiar with life because we live it. Not necessarily because it's unknown or it's difficult to know, but maybe because it's vague. It's not very specific. It's this concept, it's this thing that taking on its own doesn't give us much specificity. Life could mean just breathing and living, or life in this sense could mean how we live our lives, the kind of things we do, the kind of things that happen to us. So we don't really know in the metaphor what life is. It's vague. It hasn't been specified. But then we get the B part. And this is the thing that is familiar, or it's concrete, or it is known or easy to know. And the B in this case is chicken soup served in blue willow pattern bowls. Just to even explain this idea of whether it's known or easy to know, if we don't know chicken soup, which most people do, we know some other kind of soup, and we understand certain characteristics about it. Uh, Maybe we know chicken soup, but we've never been served chicken soup in a blue willow pattern bowl. Um, but still, it's an easy to know concept. Blue willow pattern bowl, I kind of see one of those white china bowls that has some sort of design around the rim of it, or some sort of detail that is painted in blue. So easy to know or known. Now we're gonna look back at this when we get to the Mary Oliver poem, but that's the basic construction right now. A is B, abstract, vague, or unknown, and then B being familiar, known, specific, concrete. Um, I like even in this example that Mary Oliver takes it farther than just chicken soup, because we might say that even though chicken soup is concrete, um, and technically it's a specific type of soup, the description doesn't help us know anything more specific about it, what it looks like, what it smells like, of course. And so her detail here of served in blue willow pattern bowls gives us a little bit more specificity. I also like to call attention to the fact that it uses that object verb. We talked about that in the tone and attitude video when we looked at Fear and Fame, um, that it's chicken soup served in blue willow pattern bowls. So it has a verb attached to it, and we're going to come back to that verb and say how that creates quite a bit of meaning for the poem and for this metaphor. Quick note before we get on, how to get the most out of metaphor. Um, the B part of the equation should be familiar to the reader. You don't want um, to have the B be something that's equally abstract, unfamiliar, or vague to the audience. That would be like that scenario where you come across a word that you don't know. So you look up in the dictionary what that word means, and then part of the definition of that word has another word you don't understand, and you have to go look up that word. In that case, it would be the same thing as the B not being familiar or known to the reader. They would be confused. It wouldn't help clarify or explain the A in any way. So that's how you get the most out of metaphor in one case. But also I want you to think about B having the ability to create or enhance um, an emotional response in the reader. And this is what we're going to get to when we think about chicken soup served in blue willow pattern bowls. That when we think about that, we carry with it certain emotions that as we start to identify, we realize that Mary Oliver chose this comparison so that we have a very specific emotional response. And that emotional response that we have is part of how she delivers the meaning of her poem. Last thing I'll say is, though it's okay to use metaphor to compare one concrete thing to another concrete thing, such as the old man's rocking chair is as smooth as a Cadillac, most of the time the metaphor can be replaced with close description. So it's totally fine to compare a known thing, B is B, but usually we can simply describe the old man's rocking chair with close description with those physical senses without using a metaphor and get just as much out of the description as we would the metaphor. So we want to emphasize the abstract A is B kind of formula to really get the most out of metaphor. I'm going to get out of this and I'm going to turn to Mary Oliver and Farm Country. Again, two very short poems. These poems are kind of your epitome of what poetry does. It says a lot, and it communicates a lot, and it creates pretty impactful emotional responses in the reader in a very short space. Poetry is known for packing a lot into, either packing a lot of ideas or packing a lot of emotion into a small space. And we see that in these two poems. Very short and yet very effective. So let's talk about metaphor and then talk about how that helps Mary Oliver say something. And then we'll look at Harlem as well. So here in this poem we have two metaphors. The first one we've already talked about. Life is chicken soup served in blue willow pattern bowls. There is a second metaphor, though, that doesn't have the A is B formula, but because Mary Oliver has already set up the A is B formula, we can understand that she has another metaphor at the end of the poem when she says the hen house. Now, the hen house is the B part of the formula. She leaves out the A part. So she doesn't say it again, life is a hen house. But that's essentially what she is saying. It's a comparison. Life is either chicken soup or life is the hen house. And we already see that there's an I-you dynamic in this poem. But let's break down this idea of the emotional response that the metaphors carry first. Because once we do that, then we can understand a little bit more what Oliver's trying to do with this poem. So let me just come down here a little bit. I don't know why it's doing that. So that's fine. It's going to be a little faint, but we should be able to see it. Chicken soup and hen house. These are our two metaphors that we have going in the poem. So we want to ask ourselves, when we think of chicken soup, we are familiar with it. It is known to us. It is physical. We can sense it with all our senses. When we think of chicken soup, what do we think of? What does it remind us of? How do we feel? You can start doing this in your head as I go, and maybe I won't even give it a complete list here, but very quickly we can start thinking of home or comfort, maybe even mom or grandma. We think of being sick, but eating it for healing. So again, that comforting aspect. We can say that it's comfortable. Oh, we already said comfort, but we'll repeat it with comfortable. It's warm. It's pleasant. All these things. We can keep going with the list, but I want to move on to the second part of the metaphor. Not only is it chicken soup, which reminds us of all these things, but it's chicken soup that is served in blue willow pattern bowls. So that makes me think of a sense of luxury or ease. And you can say that a lot of other different ways too. You're not only eating chicken soup, you're being served chicken soup in these very nice fancy bowls. That's a sense of ease, pleasure. It is passive luxury. And all that is what we feel, whether we identify it immediately or not. Chicken soup served in these bowls makes us feel these things or think of these things. So in this case, the B is physically specific, but also creates or enhances an emotional response. Now let's look at the hen house. We don't get physical description here, but we can quickly imagine what the hen house is like. So many of us have never walked into a hen house, but it is easy to understand. Maybe we've seen it in movies or on television or pictures of it, or we've had a friend who's explained their experience of it. And so when we think of hen house, what do we think of? Dirty, smelly, messy, chaotic, loud, difficult. We have to remember that she's going to the hen house to get a chicken, to kill. She's already told us she's sharpened her knives and put on her apron. And what she's going to do with that chicken is turn it into food and turn it into chicken soup. So there's this idea of active work compared to the passive luxury. And we can keep going on, but it's enough to see that there is a different emotional response that we carry with hen house and different associations we have towards what goes on there. And then the poem has a contrast between these two things. So first and foremost, just thinking about metaphor, is these both fit the nice A is B quality. I'm trying to describe life in two different ways. Life as chicken soup, and it carries with it all these feelings. I'm also going to describe life as the hen house, and it carries with it all these feelings and ideas. And so metaphor there, it uses a concrete comparison to say a lot and to make the reader think about and feel a lot. And that's what metaphor does best. Now, to fully understand this poem, we need to understand what the contrast of these two things is. And in order to do that, we have to look at one element that I already pointed out. We have to look at the difference between the I and the you. We know from this phrase, maybe you think, that it's a little bit of an accusation. Maybe you think. You can even maybe hear the attitude in maybe. Maybe you think that's true, but it's not. And so before she establishes this first metaphor, she speaks to an audience and establishes that they, not her, think that life is comfortable, it is for healing, it is warm, it is pleasant, it is easy, it has passive luxury. Maybe they think that. And she contrasts that to what she does. And what she does and how she sees life. She sees life as dirty, smelly, messy, chaotic, loud, difficult. It's full of active work. Now we see a contrast between the I and the you. But we still haven't fully said how she feels about the work she has to do. Because we could look at this and say, well, this lady is bitter that some people just get to be served chicken soup and she has to work for it. And it's hard and it's messy and life is difficult and she's bitter about it. I don't think that's the case with this poem, though. I think there's plenty of evidence in the other description of the poem that she likes it, that she prefers this. Maybe it's not that she prefers henhouse life to chicken soup life, but that she understands that her henhouse life is necessary to also balance out with chicken soup life. So, we can look at details in this poem like her repetition of I have, I have, I have. Shows quite a bit of ownership. I have, a little bit of pride. We know that when she's going to her henhouse life, she steps out into the sunshine. That seems to be a very positive description. It's not like she stepped out into a storm or stepped out into the rain or stepped out into the fog. She stepped out into the sunshine. She leaves the dark kitchen to step out into this positive quality. So even just looking at those two details, we start to see that what this poem is about, part of its message, is that the reader needs to consider that life cannot be just full of passive luxury and comfort and ease. That life also takes difficult, active work. That work might be chaotic, it might be loud, it might be smelly, but that the reader should embrace that part of life because there's so much pleasure and enjoyment in working for what you have and earning what you have. So that's farm country. That's how Mary Oliver is using metaphor to drive a message. She didn't just come out to her reader and say, hey, you need to consider that life is also hard work. It's not just luxury. She said it in a story with detail, with images, and in this case, with metaphor. Let's move on to Harlem. We're not going to see anything too much different here, so we're not going to talk about it as long, but what you see in this poem is a number of similes, and they follow the same construction that the metaphor does. It just includes like, and we have like throughout these, except for in the last one, which we can talk about. But the same thing goes here. What happens to a dream deferred? This is the A. It's the unknown, it's the abstract thing, which the question even reveals to us. The question is, well, it's kind of unknown, it's abstract. I'm not really sure what happens to a dream deferred. So it needs these metaphors to try to explain it, try to make sense of it. If you didn't look up deferred, You should look up deferred to understand what the meaning of the word is, to know what abstract thing you're dealing with. But for now, we're just going to call this the A, and we're going to say that there is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 similes in order to make sense of this. So unlike Mary Oliver, where she just says A is B, this poem is kind of saying A is B, or A is C, or A is D, or A is E, or A is F, and it's asking questions about which one it is. And each one of these comparisons carries with it a very specific emotional response. And if we look at those emotions, we understand what this poem is trying to say. One thing I like to point out to tie back to the tone and attitude skill practice, when we said that the verbs carry so much tone and attitude, we could look at the verbs in these metaphors and see that they do a lot of the work. He doesn't just say, what happens to a dream deferred? Is it like a raisin in the sun? Because that, I don't think, would really tell us the emotional response that we get with dry up. Dry up means that it's been maybe lifeless, that the life has come out of it. Fester, right? This very specific word. It's not like, or is it like a sore? Which we can imagine, but the word fester makes us feel like it's boiling and oozing and kind of very gross. So does run. Stink, we have as the verb there. These ones might be a little deceptive. Crust and sugar over might seem positive, but if you've ever left something sugary out, maybe a pie on the counter, and then as you leave it out longer and longer, the sugar turns into this kind of crusty, not mold because it doesn't mold, but this clumpy, crusty texture that is not edible and does not look pleasant. So that is still a negative thing here. And we have sag, and then we have explode. So a lot of verbs doing the work here. We're not going to go through them, but again, dry up like a raisin in the sun. Oh, it's lifeless. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it lose its life? Does it become infected and have trouble healing? Does it just decay? Which might be similar to dry up, but is more intense than that. Does it decay? Does it just become inedible or undesirable? Does it carry this heavy weight that cannot be overcome? Oppression, maybe. Or does it explode like a bomb, which is left out of the metaphor, but we get that it is a bomb that would explode. Each of these carries with it a very specific emotional response in the A is B formula. Now, we're not going to fully get into this poem today and what its meaning is, but I would ask you to think about, why does the last metaphor not have an A is B formula, takes out the like, takes out the bomb, makes us just imagine the bomb. It emphasizes the verb and the emotion that we would take with it. And does ending on this seem to suggest that that is his answer? Right? Is Langston Hughes asking these questions for someone else? Or does he believe that the one of these is the answer? Does he think it explodes? Does he want his audience to think it explodes? It's a good thing to consider, and we're going to return to analysis of this poem later on in the quarter. But for now, you see the A is B metaphor working. You see how metaphor can be used to not only clarify ideas, but also enhance or create an emotional effect in the reader that helps the writer deliver their message. So use this in your next skill practice for writing a metaphor. Try to identify part of the description you've written already that might be too abstract or too general, where you introduce a non-concrete topic that you want to give more specificity, that you want to enhance the emotion of by comparing it to a known thing. See if you could do that, and I look forward to reading those.